From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So we're here to listen to Peniel Joseph. I had the pleasure of interviewing Peniel on C-SPAN on the occasion of his 2010 book, Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. And it was one of those wonderful, unhurried C-SPAN book conversations. And I had never met him before, and I was so impressed not only by his intellect, but by his ease, his humility, and his introspection. I left thinking, man, I'm going to read all of that dude's books from here on until the end of time, whatever he writes. He also is author of the award-winning Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America. But the book he has come to discuss today, and why I'm sure you're all here, is Stokely, A Life, which William Jelani Cobb described in a New York Times review as an insightful, highly engaging, and fluently written biography of Stokely Carmichael, the man widely seen as heir apparent in the black leadership hierarchy to Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X following their assassinations. Like his peers at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Stokely started out as a believer in nonviolence, but his own experience and the violent encounters of others led him to concentrate his thinking on the notion of black self-defense. Carmichael was a complex figure, and that complexity is captured wonderfully in this definitive biography, Stokely, A Life. I mean, you can never be disappointed with a book when you have chapter titles like The Chocolate Fred Astaire. Peniel Joseph is an historian, activist, and professor at Tufts University, and a popular radio and television commentator on subjects such as race relations and civil rights, politics, democracy, and I must say he's got a really nice shoe collection. Please give a warm welcome to Peniel Joseph.
Hey, thank you, Kevin, for that warm introduction. I'll start by thanking the Library of Congress and the National Book Festival for this invitation to talk about Stokely, A Life. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. I spent 10 years on the life of Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture, and a lot of the questions that I've received was why? You know, why did I spend so much time? Why was Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture so interesting to me? And why did he deserve a biography? Why did he deserve this attention? And to really answer that, and before going into Stokely Carmichael's life, the legacy that he left and what it means to us in 2014, especially in the context of contemporary American race relations, the age of Obama, the age of Ferguson, where we are now. I have to begin with my mother. My mother, who's watching this right now, Jermaine Joseph, is 75 years old. She's retired, Haitian immigrant who came to the United States in the mid-1960s and really was my first history teacher. My mother was part of the 1199 SEIU union. I was on my first picket line in elementary school. She taught me values that were really, really important to shaping who I am, both as a man, as a person, a human being, but also as a writer, scholar, and thinker. And it's within that context of growing up in Jamaica, Queens, New York, and listening to speeches by Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., but also finding out about Haitian history, reading C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, reading about all these different people who struggled for social political justice, that I came to find Kwame Ture Stokely Carmichael. And I was really, really impressed by Stokely Carmichael, even as an elementary school age child. I didn't know I was going to be his biographer at the time. When I think about Stokely Carmichael, the first time I encountered Stokely was through the miniseries Eyes on the Prize. And that miniseries, extraordinary, Henry Hampton and Callie Crossley and all these people at Blackside who created really the definitive documentary about the heroic period of the civil rights movement, and they did it in 6 parts, and in 8 parts, and then in 6 parts. The young 24-year-old Stokely Carmichael is in one of those episodes, and he's calling for black power. And if you were in New York City growing up in the 1980s, in the context of everything from Spike Lee to Howard Beach to different roiling demonstrations against police brutality, that documentary was a very, very signal moment in my own political history and my own intellectual development. So I encountered Kwame Ture Stokely Carmichael by way of the miniseries Eyes on the Prize. And in subsequent years, as I went to college, as I became a thinker, a reader, writer, activist, he always stayed on my mind. The first book I wrote, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, was a history of the Black Power movement, both in America and internationally. And it was in the course of doing research on that book that I really came to deeply, deeply investigate and research the life of Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture. So that's by way of introduction. Stokely, A Life. This is a biography of a political activist who I argue in this book stands out as one of the 3 political activists in the post-war period who transforms race, democracy, civil rights, community organizing, citizenship. And that's Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture. Stokely was born June 29th, 1941 in Port-of-Spain, Trinidad. He comes to the United States 2 weeks before his 11th birthday in 1952. He moves to the Morris Park section of the Bronx. His family is one of the only black families in that neighborhood. He's a precocious, very, very intelligent child, always identifying with underdogs, has a wide array of friends, interracial friends, hugely charismatic. He becomes one of the only black students to test into the Bronx High School of Science, which is one of the best public high schools in New York City. And he becomes one of the most popular, if not the most popular, student at Bronx Science. And what's extraordinary is that Stokely Carmichael attends Bronx Science from 1956 to 1960, and it's really during some of the key years of the heroic period of the civil rights movement between 1954 and 1965. And in high school, he becomes an organizer. In high school, he's going to be mentored by Bayard Rustin, who's the key social democratic political activist, openly gay, one of the most brilliant minds of the civil rights movement. He sees Rustin as a teenager and he asks a friend, who is that speaking up there? And somebody replies to him that that's Bayard Rustin, the socialist. And Stokely says, that's who I'm gonna be when I grow up. And when we think about Bronx Science, it's very, very important because at Bronx Science and during his high school years, Stokely Carmichael is going to imbibe multiple political and intellectual traditions. Some are going to be Jewish American and a Jewish American vibrant left that's Marxist, that's socialist, that's radically democratic. Some are going to be black and global and Pan-African. He's got relatives in Harlem, and he's going and listening to street speakers in Harlem. He is listening to Pan-Africanist speeches in Harlem. He finds out about Kwame Nkrumah, the leader of Ghana. He finds out about Sekou Touré, the leader of Guinea. He finds out about Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. So even in high school, Stokely is taking these different traditions in. When we think about this heroic period of the civil rights movement, just a really short, truncated history lesson. Between May 17, 1954 and August 6, 1965, we have one of the most extraordinary periods in American history. And when we think about that period in American history, May 17, 1954 is the Brown Supreme Court desegregation decision. 1955-56 is the 13-month Montgomery bus boycott. On August 28, 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till's body is going to be found in the Tallahatchie River. Till had said, bye baby, to the wife of a white shop owner and was going to be lynched because of that. His body is going to be put on display and the cover of Jet magazine, the African-American working class magazine of the post-war period. And that's going to galvanize a whole generation of civil rights activists, including Stokely Carmichael. 1957 is Little Rock Central High School and that crisis that results in mob violence against young black people trying to integrate Little Rock Central High School. February 1st, 1960 is the start of the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, where 4 black students demand equal service. And that's going to spark hundreds of demonstrations across the United States, but very importantly, it's going to spark the creation on Easter weekend of 1960, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And we've got heroic figures from SNCC who are still alive today. Joanne Mulholland Trumpauer is here. We've got Judy Richardson. We've got Congressman John Lewis. Fannie Lou Hamer, and yes, Stokely Carmichael was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as well. 1961 are the Freedom Rides, where groups of interracial activists try to defy racial segregation across interstate travel. Very infamously, on May 4th, 1961, there's going to be a Greyhound bus that is firebombed in Anniston, Alabama. These are going to give us some of the most iconic pictures and portraits of the civil rights era, but they're also going to force the hand of the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, to send in federal marshals into the South. 1961 is also the year of really raging protests all across the United States in terms of counter demonstrations for civil rights protest and integration. 1962 is the year of James Meredith, Ole Miss. James Meredith becomes the first black student to integrate the University of Mississippi. There's going to be 3 days of rioting that leave 1 person dead. 1963 is the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. And in '63, the city of Birmingham, Alabama, is literally and figuratively on fire. Martin Luther King Jr. connects with a local movement led by the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to try to desegregate the city of Birmingham, Alabama. Very famously, King is incarcerated in Birmingham, and he writes on scraps of paper, "Letter from Birmingham Jail." And he really defends the movement against critics who say the movement should move slower. The movement should wait on freedom and justice and democracy. One of the best lines from King's letter from Birmingham Jail is King arguing that in the future, the young men and women who are being incarcerated and brutalized and arrested in Birmingham are going to be remembered as heroes. And he says that they're going to be remembered as heroes for bringing the nation back to, quote, those great wells of democracy dug deep by the founding fathers. 1963 is also the year of German Shepherds and fire hoses in Birmingham. Fire hoses that were powerful enough to take the bark off of trees. John F. Kennedy says that he's sick. He tells the press that he's sick from the scenes that he's witnessed in Birmingham of German Shepherds and fire hoses and over 1,000 young children as young as 8 years old being incarcerated for trying to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama. '63 is also the year of what I've called Kennedy's finest moment, June 11th, 1963, where Kennedy delivers a forceful and robust and eloquent speech about race relations, American democracy, and citizenship in a live, nationally televised address where he calls the civil rights problem in the United States a moral problem that is as old as Scripture and as clear as the Constitution. The very next morning after Kennedy's speech, Medgar Evers is assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. And Medgar Evers was the heroic field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, and certainly his work has been continued by his widow, Myrlie Evers Williamson. 1963 is also the year of the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. And it's important to remember that the very first words that Dr. King speaks at the March on Washington, he says, "Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy." The civil rights movement was always a movement about radical democracy. November 22nd, 1963 is the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy's assassination is really going to send shockwaves throughout the country, but by 1964 it also provides a context for comprehensive civil rights legislation. And 64 is the year of not just the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but the year of Freedom Summer. And this year is the 50th anniversary of SNCC's Summer Project and Freedom Summer, which really is an experiment in interracial democracy in Mississippi, something that Stokely Carmichael contributed to, and many others did as well. And Freedom Summer is mostly remembered for the murders, the tragic murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, 3 civil rights workers who were killed right outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, went missing June 21st, 1964. 1965 is recalled as the year of the Voting Rights Act. In March of 1965, in Alabama, at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, nonviolent demonstrators were routed by Alabama state troopers, including future Congressman John Lewis, who then was chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That violence, known as Bloody Sunday on March 7th, 1965, inspires Lyndon Johnson on March 15th, 1965, in a joint address to Congress to say that civil rights is a national priority, voting rights is a national priority, and Johnson calls it a turning point in the politics of the dignity of humankind and for the destiny of democracy. August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. 5 days later, Watts, Los Angeles, explodes after an encounter between police and local people. Now, that's the heroic period of the civil rights movement, 1954 to 65. And I preface my comments on Stokely Carmichael by giving us a short sketch of the heroic period of the civil rights movement, precisely because even before Carmichael calls for Black Power on June 16, 1966, he's one of the key activists in the United States working for civil rights and radical democracy during the second half of the civil rights movement's heroic period. So when we think about Stokely Carmichael, before we can even talk about the movement for Black Power, we think about Carmichael as a community organizer, a community activist who between 1960 and 1966 was arrested 27 times for civil rights organizing. A student right here in Washington, D.C. at Howard University who joins the Nonviolent Action Group, a group of some of the most committed and brilliant young activists of the period who are trying to not just desegregate parts of the South and parts of Washington, D.C., and places like Cambridge, Maryland. They are trying to transform democratic institutions in the United States of America. That's what they're trying to do. And what's interesting about Stokely Carmichael is that Stokely finds his vocation as an organizer. He finds his vocation as an organizer. He visits Mississippi for the first time at the age of 19 in 1961, and it's going to be the first time that he's also arrested. He's arrested as a freedom rider, June 8th, 1961. And he's going to spend not just time in Hinds County Jail in Jackson, Mississippi, but he's going to spend over 30 days in Parchman Penitentiary, Parchman Farm, one of Mississippi's, or the state of Mississippi's worst prison farm. And it's really in Parchman, and people like John Lewis are there. There's so many different, Jim Farmer is there. There's so many different activists who are spending time in jail. But what's interesting is that Carmichael's experience in jail is going to galvanize his political activism. So rather than be discouraged by that time period in jail, he calls up his mother before he's going to New Orleans, and they're going to get to Mississippi by way of New Orleans, and tells his mother that there's going to be media and journalists who are calling up. And he wants her to tell them that no matter what happens, she's proud of him, right? she tells him, May Charles, his mother, and he calls her affectionately May Charles. May Charles says, I don't want you involved in any of that civil rights mess. Stokely tells her the movement has become his life, and he doesn't want her, and you know, when you're speaking to your mother, you don't ever want your mom to embarrass you in front of people. And he's saying, I don't want to be embarrassed, Mom. So whenever the press calls you, the line to tell them is that you're proud of me, right? So Stokely ends up in jail. He's in Parchman Penitentiary, and the press does call her up, and May Charles tells them that she's so proud of her son, she doesn't know what she's going to do. So she did follow and heed Stokely's advice. Now, when we think about Carmichael as part of this, one of the key organizers in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he's going to fall in love with the South. That first visit in 1961 to Mississippi is going to be just the tip of the iceberg. People like Bob Moses were in Macomb, Mississippi. Stokely visits Jackson. By 62, he's going to be in Greenwood, Mississippi. 62, 63, 64. By the time of Freedom Summer, Stokely's going to be the 2nd Congressional District Director, right? Heading activists who are organizing in the Mississippi Delta. So when we think about Stokely and the heroic period of the Civil Rights Movement, what was he doing? He was an organizer. He was living and working among poor black people in the Mississippi Delta. And when we think about the black folks in the Mississippi Delta in the post-war period, these are African Americans who oftentimes didn't have birth certificates, would never have certificates of death. Many never had left the surrounding confines of the plantations that they were on, right? And what SNCC tried to do, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was not serve as leaders, but provide help for local leadership. So Fannie Lou Hamer, and we celebrate this past week the 50th anniversary of Mrs. Hamer's speech, where she spoke before the Credentials Committee at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And she talked about being beaten in Winona, Mississippi. She talked about the hardships that poor black people were facing in the Deep South. And she told the Credentials Committee that they were facing these troubles because they wanted to be treated like decent human beings. And she said that she questioned America if there was no political representation for American citizens who happened to be too poor and too black. What's interesting when we think about Stokely Carmichael, Carmichael is going to be one of the biggest cheerleaders and supporters of Fannie Lou Hamer. He talks about Fannie Lou Hamer in an interview in 1965 in Chicago with Studs Terkel, the very famous luminary, activist, oral historian, and just all around brilliant icon, Studs Terkel. And he says that Martin Luther King Jr. is very important, but Fannie Lou Hamer is more important. And Studs Terkel says, well, what do you mean? I mean, Martin Luther King Jr., how can she be more important? He says that Fannie Lou Hamer is more important because there are more Fannie Lou Hamers in the United States than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s. And he says that his vision of American democracy is found when Mrs. Hamer gets the respect and the credit and also the access that she deserves. So what's interesting for us is that before he becomes this black power icon and this image and this symbol of political revolution, before he's with Fidel Castro and with Kwame Nkrumah and others, Stokely Carmichael is pursuing small d radical democracy in the Deep South. That's what he's pursuing. And I think one of the most interesting parts for me of this, doing research on this book, was the relationship between Dr. King and Stokely Carmichael. Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael were friends. They met for the first time in 1963 at Howard University. Stokely serves as his chauffeur and bodyguard during Freedom Summer in 1964. They march together in Selma. So Stokely is in Selma during the Selma to Montgomery demonstrations in 1965. And that relationship really comes to the fore once Stokely becomes chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in May of 1966. And the Meredith March, from June 7th to June 26, 1966, is the march that transforms both Stokely Carmichael's life and the civil rights movement. That's the march where James Meredith, who had been the first black student to enroll at Ole Miss, is going to be shot on the second day, June 6th, of a one-man march across the state of Mississippi to prove that a black man could march through Mississippi without fear. He's going to be shot and injured, and Carmichael, Martin Luther King Jr., and these civil rights leaders are going to come to his bedside, and they vow to continue his march. And it's along that march that Stokely Carmichael, after being arrested for the 27th time in Greenwood, Mississippi, is going to call for black power, right? And what did black power mean? Well, black power, according to Carmichael, meant radical social, cultural, political, and economic self-determination. King and Carmichael had political disagreements. Dr. King says, don't use the term black power, Stokely, because people are equating that term with violence. Carmichael says that the decision to unleash black power was a collective SNCC decision, and black people need to start defining political and social phenomena for themselves. When we think about Carmichael and King along that march, even though there are disputes and disagreements, they find common ground in a shared love for black people and black culture, especially poor black people. What's very interesting in our contemporary context now, and we talk about the politics of Ferguson, social economic poverty that we've seen, police brutality, is that the black people who Stokely Carmichael was most concerned about were the poorest of the poor. It wasn't just students, even though he was concerned about students. It wasn't elites. It was the poorest of the poor, because those folks had been denied constitutional rights, had been denied citizenship, and were closed and shut out of American democracy. So when we think about King and Carmichael, that relationship is going to become very, very close between 1966 and King's death, April 4th, 1968. And in the course of doing research here on Stokely's life, one of the most fascinating things to me was Stokely's anti-war activism, and the fact that starting in 1966, the biggest anti-war activist in the United States was Stokely Carmichael. And that Carmichael is the person who is one of the people who inspires Martin Luther King Jr. to come out forcefully against the war at Riverside Church in New York, April 4th, 1967. Carmichael gives a powerful speech October 28, 1966, at the University of California, Berkeley. Over 10,000 people are there, and in that speech, he criticizes the war in Vietnam, and he talks to white students about American democracy, racial privilege, and what can be done in the context of the civil rights and black power struggle to transform democratic institutions in the United States. It's a powerful speech, and I've interviewed people who were there at Berkeley, people who were there at the speech, and what they all say is that that speech for them was a human rights speech. They all say that Carmichael's anti-war activism inspired them to speak out against the war. King and Carmichael, by April 15th, 1967, are going to be on the same platform at the largest anti-war demonstration in American history up until that point in New York City at the UN building. 400,000 people are there, and Carmichael speaks before King. Carmichael criticizes the war in Vietnam. He criticizes violence that's happening in the United States and connects the war in Vietnam to the civil rights and black power movements domestically. Martin Luther King Jr. speaks after, and they meet at Harry Belafonte's apartment after the demonstration is over. And Carmichael Stokely teases King about his anti-war activism. He says that the only reason you're coming out against the war is because of the activism that I've been doing, right? And if you can imagine a 25-year-old Stokely Carmichael teasing a 37, 38-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., who has got a great sense of humor, it gives you a great portrait of their relationship. Later that month, Dr. King calls up Stokely in Atlanta. They're both in Atlanta. And King asks Stokely to attend his church service the next day. And he says, what are you doing tomorrow? And Stokely says that, like a good heathen, I'm not going to church, but I'm out here doing the work of the people. Dr. King says, I really want you to come to my church tomorrow. And Stokely says, why do you want me to come so badly? And Dr. King says, tomorrow I'm giving my full comprehensive speech against the war in Vietnam. And Stokely replies that he's going to be there tomorrow, and he's going to be in the front row of his pew. And when we look at the footage, there's great footage of Dr. King's speech, April 30th, 1967, Ebenezer Baptist in Atlanta, Georgia. After he makes that speech and says and vows to study war no more, the person who's leading the standing ovation is Stokely Carmichael, right? And of course, he's got the dark shades on, and he's doing his thing. But it's Stokely Carmichael. So when we think about Stokely and what does he represent, why is he so important? Stokely is not just an activist for radical democracy. After he becomes a Black Power activist, he is a full-blown political revolutionary. He becomes an anti-war activist, an anti-imperialist activist, a critic of American capitalism, and really American hegemony around the world, right? And this is especially crucially important because it's Stokely Carmichael who provides a context for the Black Panther Party. 1965-66, it's Carmichael along with other SNCC activists, Bob Mance, Judy Richardson, who go to Lowndes County, Alabama, the buckle of Alabama's Black Belt, and they're helping local people, John Hewlett, Annie Ponder, others, local people organize for democracy in Lowndes County. In Lowndes County, 80% African American, no Black public officials, right? 50 years later, we have similar instances now. But in 1965, trying to organize in Lowndes was hugely dangerous. And they're going to organize in 65, 66, a Lowndes County freedom organization whose nickname is going to be the Black Panther Party, right? That symbol in Lowndes County. And that symbol is going to travel from Lowndes County all the way to Oakland, California, when we think about the Black Panther Party for self-defense, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, Kathleen Cleaver. And so when we think about Stokely Carmichael, who's going to be named honorary prime minister of the Panthers in 1968, he's going to provide a platform for not just the Black Panther Party, but for the anti-war movement that the New Left, that different radical activists are going to be participating and supporting in the late 1960s. Stokely's legacy is a transformative legacy, but he might be the most important activist that people in our contemporary period have never heard of. And why is that? Well, Stokely leaves the United States of America by 1969, and the reason he leaves the United States is because of his international travels in 1967. In 1967, he does a 5-month tour of the world. He's in London at the Dialectics of Liberation Conference with people like C.L.R. James and Allen Ginsberg. He's in Cuba with Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro says that Stokely Carmichael is under his protection. If anything happens to Stokely, who's the leader of the Black Revolution in the United States, there's going to be trouble. He's in Algeria with the revolutionary Algerian leaders who offer him headquarters and support, something that Carmichael's not going to take them up on, but that the Black Panthers will in a couple of years, right? He is in Conakry, Guinea, where he meets two of his biggest political heroes, Kwame Nkrumah, who's been exiled to Guinea after a coup in Ghana in February of 1966, and Sekou Touré, the charismatic Ghanaian leader who had told the French to leave Guinea and had suffered the consequences after. He also meets up with Miriam Makeba in Conakry, and Miriam Makeba was the beautiful and brilliant South African singer, activist, icon who had been introduced to the United States, the American public, by Harry Belafonte in the 1950s, and Miriam Makeba and Stokely begin a whirlwind romance despite a 9-year age gap, and they are married by 1968 and become this global Pan-African couple. When we think about the international trip, meeting with Kwame Nkrumah, meeting with Sekou Touré changes and transforms Stokely Carmichael's life. He comes back to the United States as a committed Pan-Africanist who's convinced that the key to black equality and black liberation lies in the unification of Africa. And he promises to return to Africa. So by 1969, he does just that. And between 69 and 1998, even though he returns for tours of the United States, political speaking tours, he becomes a committed anti-imperialist, Pan-Africanist revolutionary. Changes his name to Kwame Ture in honor of Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Toure, and really becomes, by the 1980s, in the context of the Reagan Revolution, Thatcherism, the rise of neoliberalism, and really the counter-revolution that transforms the hopes and dreams that 1960s era radicals and revolutionaries had carried with them. In that context, Kwame Ture becomes anachronistic because he believes in the idea of a global political revolution. One of my favorite parts of studying Kwame Ture is reading about Barack Obama's reaction to seeing Kwame Ture at Columbia University in the early 80s. And young Obama in his early 20s, he talks about, Kwame Ture was talking about Pan-Africanism. He had a critique of capitalism. And, he's just basically spitting fire. He's spitting fire, speaking words of fire. And Obama recounts in Dreams from My Father, he says that his eyes blazed as he spoke, right? The eyes of a madman or a saint, right? And I'm here to say that Kwame Ture was neither a madman nor a saint. He was a radical political activist who was unapologetic in pursuing social, political, economic, and cultural equality for black folks in the United States and globally. That's what he was. He had his flaws, he had his shortcomings, and as his biographer, I can spell them out. But what's so very important is the fact that he provides us with a blueprint to understand American race relations in a wholly different and expansive way from the cast of iconic characters who we usually look at, right? He is the bridge between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. He provides a context for radical political self-determination even when it's unpopular, right? Speaking truth to power even when the standing ovations stop. Right? And so when you measure what does it mean to work in the Mississippi Delta with poor black sharecroppers? What does it mean to work in tent cities in Alabama after sharecroppers have been kicked out of where they've lived for decades and decades because they want to organize for the right to vote? What does it mean when you are writing about small d democracy in 1966 in places like the New Republic and the New York Review of Books, but by the time you start saying that you're against the war in Vietnam, people don't want to publish you, and they don't want to hear your opinion, right? Kwame Ture was an unapologetic political revolutionary even after the age of political revolution ended in the United States. So his life is especially important and crucial, I believe, in our contemporary period. When we think about where we are in 2014 on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and it was the Civil Rights Act that Stokely's activism helped make happen. Sometimes we've got books about the Civil Rights Act and it's a top-down experience. Certainly it's going to be both. It's not just top-down, but it's also bottom-up. The reason why the social change and political change and transformation in the 1960s happened during the civil rights movement's heroic period is because social movements created such disruption in the United States. They created such a movement and momentum for change that there had to be legislative and political solutions applied to real-world problems. President Kennedy, when he speaks on June 11th, 1963, he says as much when he says that there's a revolution, and this is a sitting American president who says there's a revolution happening right here in the United States, and that revolution can be either violent or peaceful, right? When we think about Stokely Carmichael, the most important aspect of Carmichael's activism was the way in which he helped organize poor black people to try to transform democratic institutions in the United States that did not want to be transformed. One of the mythologies of the civil rights movement that we live in today is this idea that one, it's over, and two, everybody loved the fact that it was going on. So you start with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a fairy tale. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and then it ends with Barack Obama, right? It ends with Obama. So by the time of Obama's election, people say, okay, that's it. The civil rights movement, it's over, you know? And people will even tell black people, not just post-racialism, but say, man, you got Obama, what else do you want? As if you cash Obama's checks and eat Obama's food, right? You know, I haven't gotten my invitation to the White House, you know? So when we think about the civil rights movement was always contested. There were millions of Americans who had a different conception of American democracy, a conception of democracy that wasn't expansive enough to include Fannie Lou Hamer, that wasn't expansive enough to include Ella Baker. And remember, Ella Baker is the brilliant organizer who is the lead organizer of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had been a NAACP organizer in her own right, told those young students Easter weekend that it was about more than just a hamburger. And the reason she told those young students at Shaw University in North Carolina Easter weekend that the sit-in movement was about more than just a hamburger was because by April of 1960, the New York Times and newspapers and mainstream media, they're trying to say, well, the movement, that's what it's about. It's about, you know, people just want to get access to lunch counters. And Ella Baker said, this is not about just lunch counters or hamburgers, right? This was about small d democracy. James Baldwin, the brilliant and prophetic writer, he says it in a way that only James Baldwin can. He writes in 1961 that the young people who are organizing and are in demonstrations all across the South at lunch counters, they're doing it to do more than what Baldwin calls sip tasteless cups of coffee at sleazy lunch counters all across the South. That's James Baldwin, that's not me. So what's important for us when we think about Stokely Carmichael and the civil rights movement, when we think about where we are today in the context of American race relations and race and democracy, civil rights and citizenship, is that Carmichael's life provides an example, Kwame Ture, of a life well lived, right? He doesn't become a hedge fund leader. He's not the world's biggest banker. He didn't invent the iPhone. What he did was provide millions of poor, at times semi-educated, semi-literate black people hope. And the way he did that was through organizing for small d democracy and then a political revolution, but also calling for black power and black self-determination. The whole idea of black is beautiful is impossible without Stokely Carmichael. The whole idea of self-determination and black people thinking of themselves in ways that in the 1960s were profoundly, in some ways, impossible. That they were eloquent, that they were beautiful, that they were intelligent, that they had the right to disagree with each other and with the mainstream. It's impossible without Stokely Carmichael. So, and I guess we're gonna take some questions at some point. So I'll conclude by saying that the most important thing to me about writing this book, Stokely Alive, was providing an introduction to Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, to a whole new generation of Americans who don't realize the profound impact that he had on American democracy and globally. And providing an introduction to somebody who, whether you agree or disagree with aspects of what he did, was always, always, always personally sincere, right? His sincerity and his love for the underdog and poor people and real passionate belief in social and political justice is what really stands out for me. And the fact that he really, really walked the talk. This was somebody who didn't just say they were advocating for black equality. He lived a life of advocating for black equality, even when at times that meant injuring himself and not getting the kind of access or benefits that would have come if he had ameliorated or moderated his stance. So I think that the important part for us to remember about Stokely Carmichael is that his willingness and his courage to speak truth to power, but his willingness to live and work and die among poor black people is really outstanding and provides a legacy that hopefully we can all learn from. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.